It was May of the year 1943. The wind carried sand across the Tunisian desert like a pale curtain drawn over the dead. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann lay flat against the earth behind what remained of a Panzer IV, its armor split open like the shell of some enormous insect, black smoke still curling from the turret hatch. The sound of American artillery had stopped 20 minutes ago. Now there was only silence and the whistle of wind, and somewhere in the distance the grind of tank treads against stone. He was 24 years old. His uniform was stiff with dried sweat and dust that had worked its way into every crease of fabric, every pore of skin. His canteen had been empty since dawn. Around him lay the scattered remnants of his company, men he had marched with from Tunis to this God-forsaken stretch of nothing, where the Afrika Korps had finally run out of fuel, ammunition, and time. The white flag came up first from the command position, a torn bedsheet tied to a radio antenna, then another, then a dozen more, sprouting across the broken landscape like strange flowers after rain. Klaus rose slowly, hands raised above his head. His rifle lay in the sand where he had placed it, bolt open, magazine removed. Around him, other men were standing, gaunt figures in feldgrau, faces dark with sun and defeat. The Americans came forward in a loose line, their uniforms strange and abundant, their equipment gleaming. A sergeant gestured with his rifle toward a collection point. "Move," the sergeant said in accented German. "Hands where I can see them." Klaus walked. Behind him, the last artillery pieces of the Wehrmacht in Africa stood silent, barrels cold, their crews scattered into captivity. The Liberty ship rolled in the Atlantic swells, and Klaus spent the first 3 days bent over a bucket in the hold, retching up what little food the Americans gave him. They had been processed at a camp in Oran first, stripped, deloused, photographed, assigned numbers. His was 4-87293. They took his belt and shoelaces and gave him fatigue stamped with the letters PW in white paint across the back. The crossing took 11 days. Men played cards in the hold, using buttons for stakes. Some prayed. Others simply stared at the riveted steel walls, faces empty. Klaus tried to understand what had happened, how the invincible Wehrmacht had come to this, packed like cattle in the belly of an enemy ship, crossing an ocean toward an unknown fate. They arrived at Norfolk in the dark. The ship docked with a shudder, and then there was shouting in English, and the shuffle of hundreds of feet on metal stairs. They emerged onto the deck, into warm, wet air that smelled of salt and coal smoke and something green and growing. Floodlights turned night into day. Beyond the docks, Klaus could see the lights of the city, more lights than he had seen in years of blackout and war. Electric lights burning without fear. A waste of power that spoke of resources beyond imagining. They were loaded onto trains, passenger cars, not cattle cars, with guards stationed at each end. Through the windows, Klaus watched America pass in the darkness. The lights of small towns, the glow of distant cities, the vast emptiness between. They traveled for 2 days, the guards bringing food in metal trays, beans and bread, and sometimes meat, portions larger than anything Klaus had seen since before the war. July 3, 1943. We have arrived somewhere in the American South. Texas, they tell us. The heat is different here than in Africa. Wet heat that makes the air itself feel heavy. But there is water here. Grass, trees. I have not seen so much green in 2 years. Camp Concordia sat in the flat expanse of South Texas, a grid of barracks, surrounded by a double fence of barbed wire and guard towers that looked almost decorative in the brilliant sunlight. The compound was new. Klaus could smell fresh-cut pine from the barracks, see the raw, red earth where grass had not yet grown. They were assigned to Barracks 7, 40 men, to a building. The bunks were wooden but sturdy, each man given 2 blankets, a mattress filled with straw, and a footlocker. There was electricity. There were latrines with running water, showers that actually worked. Klaus stood in the barracks that first afternoon, looking at his bunk, and felt a strange vertigo. He had expected prison. He had expected camps like the ones he had seen photographs of in Poland, places where enemies of the Reich were sent to die slowly. Instead, this looked like a military installation, spare and functional, but not designed for cruelty. The camp routine established itself quickly. Roll call at dawn, breakfast in a mess hall where the food was plain but sufficient, oatmeal and coffee, sometimes eggs, bread with margarine. Then work assignments. Klaus was assigned to a work detail at a farm 15 miles from camp. 20 prisoners, 2 guards, loaded into the back of a truck each morning and driven out along dusty roads through flat country where cotton grew in endless rows, under a sky that seemed larger than any sky Klaus had ever seen. The farmer was a man named Holloway, lean and sunburned, with hands calloused from decades of work. He spoke no German, and Klaus spoke little English, but Holloway communicated through gestures and example, showing them how to repair fence lines, clear irrigation ditches, mend equipment in the barn where tools hung in organized rows. It was hard work, but Klaus had known hard work before. What surprised him was the casual nature of the supervision. The 2 guards sat in the shade of the truck, rifles leaning against the bumper, smoking cigarettes and talking. Holloway walked among the prisoners, checking their work, nodding approval or demonstrating again when they made mistakes. By the end of the first week, he was handing them tools and walking away, trusting them to complete tasks unsupervised. This made no sense. Klaus had served in the Wehrmacht for 4 years. He knew military discipline. He knew that prisoners were dangerous, that they would escape given any opportunity, yet here he was, 20 miles from camp, given a hammer and a box of nails, told to repair a section of barn roof while the guards dozed in the truck, and the farmer drove off to check another field. He could have run. They all could have. The flat Texas landscape stretched away to the horizon with no walls, no fences except those dividing one field from another. But where would they run to? They were Germans in America, thousands of miles from any front, wearing clothes that marked them as prisoners. And more than that, something else kept them there, something Klaus could not yet name. At midday, Holloway's wife brought lunch to the field. She was a small woman in a faded dress, her face kind in a worn way. She set out sandwiches and a jug of sweet tea waving the prisoners over to eat in the shade. Klaus took his sandwich, thick slices of bread with ham and cheese, and ate slowly, watching the woman talk with the guards in English, laughing at something one of them said. She looked at the prisoners without fear. That was what struck him. She stood among 20 enemy soldiers, men who had fought against her country, and she showed no fear at all. The summer passed in a rhythm of work and heat. Klaus learned more English, enough to understand simple instructions. In the evenings, after roll call and dinner, prisoners were allowed to gather in recreation areas. There was a canteen where they could buy cigarettes and candy bars with scrip they earned from their labor, 80 cents a day. There was a library stocked with books in German, sent by the Red Cross. There was even a makeshift theater where prisoners performed concerts on Saturday nights. But there was also tension. Some prisoners were committed Nazis, men who had volunteered for the SS or Hitler Youth, who still believed in the Führer's vision. They enforced discipline in the barracks, reporting anyone who spoke favorably of the Americans, maintaining a parallel chain of command. Klaus learned to be careful with his words. He kept his thoughts to himself, worked his assignments, stayed out of political debates. But he watched everything, and he thought. August 17th, 1943. Today, Holloway let us use his tools without supervision. We repaired an entire section of fence while he was gone to town. When he returned, he inspected our work, nodded, and said, "Good job." He trusted us. Why does he trust us? We are his enemies. September came, and with it a change. More prisoners were sent to farms across the region, to sawmills and canneries. Klaus's detail was reduced to 10 men and a single guard. A corporal from Oklahoma named Mitchell, who had been a farmer himself before the war. One morning, Mitchell handed Klaus a list written in careful German. "Holloway needs these supplies from town," Mitchell said. "Hardware store on Main Street. You know the way?" Klaus stared at the list. Nails, wire, 3 replacement handles for hose. "You want me to go to town?" "Alone?" "Take Otto with you. Truck's at the farm. Holloway will give you the keys. Buy what's on the list. Bring back the receipt and the change. Be back by 1500 hours. Klaus looked at Otto, who looked back with the same expression of disbelief. "You're letting us drive into town without a guard." "That's right. Don't make me regret this." They drove to town in Holloway's truck, a battered Ford that rattled over the washboard roads. Neither of them spoke much. Klaus kept his hands steady on the wheel, but his mind was racing. This was impossible. This was beyond any military logic he had ever learned. You did not give prisoners a vehicle and send them unsupervised into a populated area. The town was small, a main street with a few blocks of shops, a courthouse, a grain elevator. Klaus parked in front of the hardware store and sat for a moment, looking at the people walking past. Women with shopping bags, old men sitting on benches, children chasing each other down the sidewalk. Normal life, utterly untouched by war. He got out of the truck, Otto following. They walked into the hardware store together, still wearing their PW stamped fatigues. The man behind the counter looked up, noted their clothes, and nodded. "Help you, boys." Klaus handed him the list. The man read it, then started pulling items from shelves and bins. He moved without hurry, without nervousness. Other customers came and went, glancing at the two Germans, but not staring, not frightened. One woman even smiled. They drove back to the farm. Mitchell was waiting, leaning against a fence post. He checked the receipt, pocketed the change, and went back to his cigarette without comment. That night, Klaus lay in his bunk and tried to make sense of what had happened. By every rule he knew, he should have driven that truck to Mexico. But he had not even considered it seriously. He had been trusted. Against all logic, the Americans had treated him as if his word meant something, and he had found that he did not want to betray that trust. September 21st, 1943. I have begun to understand something. The Americans do not fear us because they do not need to fear us. Their strength is not in their guards or their fences. It is in something else, something I have no word for in German. Fall arrived, bringing cooler weather. The work continued. Harvest time now. The fields full of cotton that needed picking. Klaus spent long days working alongside Mexican laborers and local farmhands too old for the draft. Sometimes Holloway worked beside them, telling stories that Klaus only half understood, but that seemed important. One afternoon in November, Klaus was repairing a fence near the farmhouse when Holloway's daughter came out with a jug of water. She was perhaps 7 years old, thin and solemn. "You're from Germany," she said in English. Klaus understood enough to nod. "Yes." "Are you a bad man?" He paused, hammer in hand. This child stood here without fear, asking him an honest question. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I thought I was good man. Now, I don't know." She considered this with a child's seriousness. Then she picked up the water jug and held it out to him. "You should drink. It's hot." He took the jug and drank. The water was cool and sweet. The girl watched him, then nodded and walked back to the house. That moment stayed with Klaus. That simple interaction, a child offering water to her father's prisoner, trusting him not to harm her, seeing him as human. In Germany, he had been taught that strength came from purity, from obedience, from the willingness to destroy anything weak. But this child's trust carried more strength than any Wehrmacht division. November 8th, 1943. I begin to see what we have lost. We thought strength meant conquest, meant forcing the world to bend. But these Americans have strength we never understood. They are strong enough to show mercy, strong enough to trust their enemies. Winter came, mild by German standards. Klaus spent more time in camp, attending classes organized by the Americans, English lessons, even a course in American history, taught by a teacher from town. The Nazi prisoners boycotted these classes, but Klaus attended, listening as the teacher explained the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, ideas about rights and government that seemed almost dangerously naive, yet had somehow built this powerful nation. Christmas arrived. The Americans decorated the camp with lights and a large tree. They served turkey and stuffing, vegetables, even pie. The Red Cross delivered packages from home. Klaus received a letter from his mother. She wrote carefully, knowing censors would read every word, but he could sense fear beneath her news. The bombing had gotten worse. Many families had lost sons. Everyone was tired, but they trusted in final victory. Reading those words, Klaus felt something break inside him. His mother still believed. She still trusted the propaganda, still thought Germany was winning. And he could not tell her the truth, that he had seen the real America, had witnessed its resources and resolve, had understood that Germany never had a chance. The new year came, 1944. More prisoners arrived, men taken in Italy, bringing stories of retreat. The main enforcers tried to maintain morale, insisted that secret weapons would turn the tide. But fewer prisoners believed them now. Spring brought planting season. Klaus returned to work at Holloway's farm. He had learned enough English now to hold simple conversations, and the farmer talked as they worked. About soil and weather, about his son who was in the army, somewhere in France. "You got family?" Holloway asked one day. "Mother," Klaus said. "Father dead before war. 2 sisters. You miss them?" "Yes." "This war," Holloway said. "It's a damn shame. Good men on both sides, killing each other over what? My boy's over there shooting at men like you. Doesn't make a lick of sense." Klaus had no answer. What Holloway said was heresy by the standards Klaus had been raised under, the idea that enemy soldiers were not monsters, but simply men. Yet sitting there in the Texas shade, speaking to this farmer who had trusted him with tools and freedom, Klaus found that Holloway's words made more sense than anything he had heard in years. That summer, the work details expanded even further. Some farms received prisoners with no military supervision at all. Klaus heard of prisoners who had been given bicycles to ride to work sites, who ate meals with farming families. The escape rate from American POW camps was nearly zero, not because the fences were strong or the guards were vigilant, but because the prisoners had nowhere to go and no reason to try. Klaus understood this now. He had stopped thinking of himself as a prisoner. He was simply a man living in a strange place, waiting for the war to end, working, because work gave purpose. June 15, 1944. News has come that the Allies have landed in France. I feel nothing. No sadness, no joy. Only a strange certainty that it is ending now. I wonder what Germany will look like when I return. The summer of 1944 passed, heat and work, the slow progression of crops. But the mood in camp shifted. More prisoners arrived. Younger men, boys of 16 and 17, sent to fight with weeks of training. They brought stories of chaos and collapse, of cities destroyed by bombing, of the Eastern Front devouring armies. The Nazi enforcers grew more violent, beating anyone who spoke of defeat. But their power was waning. The Americans intervened, separating the committed Nazis into different barracks. Klaus kept working at Holloway's farm. The routines were comfortable now, familiar. Sometimes, driving back to camp in the evening, Klaus would forget for a moment that he was a prisoner at all. Fall came. Holloway's wife preserved everything. Tomatoes and bananas pickles, preparing for winter. She had learned a few words of German and would greet Klaus with Guten Morgen each morning, smiling. These small kindnesses accumulated, wearing away Klaus's certainties. He had been taught that Americans were decadent and weak, that their democracy was chaos. But he saw now that this teaching had been backwards. The Americans were not weak. Their strength simply took a different form. When Holloway handed Klaus a tool and walked away, he was exercising a form of power. The power to believe in another person's integrity. Germany had lost that power. It had built itself on suspicion and terror, on neighbor informing against neighbor. And in doing so, it had become brittle, unable to bend without breaking. America bent constantly. It argued, it debated, but it did not break. October 3rd, 1944. True strength does not come from forcing others to obey. It comes from creating a society where obedience is voluntary, where people follow laws because they believe in them. The Americans have this. We never did. One day in December, Holloway called him over. "Klaus, I got a question for you. When this war ends and you go home, what will you do?" Klaus thought about Germany, the country he had left as a soldier. He thought about the Germany that would exist after the war, defeated and destroyed. "I will rebuild," he said finally. "If Germany allows, I will farm, like you, grow things." Holloway nodded slowly. "That's good. That's what the world needs. People willing to grow things instead of destroy them." He paused. "You're a good worker, Klaus. You remember you're a good man. Don't let anyone tell you different." Klaus felt something in his chest, a tightness. This farmer, this enemy, was speaking to him with more respect than any German officer ever had. "Thank you," Klaus said. The news came in May of 1945. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had collapsed in 12. In Camp Concordia, the announcement brought a strange silence. No celebrations, no despair, only a collective exhalation. Klaus continued working at Holloway's farm through that summer and into fall. Letters from his mother had stopped coming months ago. He did not know if she was alive, if his sisters had survived. The reports from Germany spoke of total destruction, cities reduced to rubble, starvation, and chaos. In November of 1945, the orders came. Klaus and 200 other prisoners would be shipped to New York, then eventually to Germany. They had 2 weeks to prepare. On his last day at Holloway's farm, Klaus worked until evening. When he was done, Holloway came out with 2 bottles of beer. "Figured we'd mark the occasion," Holloway said. They sat on the porch steps and drank in silence, watching the sun sink. The air was cool, the sky enormous. "I never thanked you," Klaus said finally. for treating me like a man, not like prisoner, not like enemy, like a man. Holloway looked at his beer bottle. Well, that's what you are, aren't it? Man's still a man, no matter which uniform he wears. In Germany, Klaus said slowly, we forgot this. We saw only uniforms, only categories. That's a hard thing to lose, but you can learn it again. You already have. They finished their beers. Then Holloway stood and offered his hand. Good luck, Klaus. I hope you find your family. Klaus shook his hand. I will try. I will remember what I learned here. The ship that carried Klaus east sailed in a convoy. Klaus stood on deck sometimes, watching the gray water. The war was over. He had been shown something he could never have imagined. He had been trusted, and that trust had changed him more profoundly than any propaganda ever could. December 10th, 1945. Tomorrow we arrive in Germany. I do not know what I will find, but I know what I carry with me. I have learned that strength is not the absence of mercy, but the ability to show it. I have learned that trust is the highest form of power. I have learned that the Americans defeated us not because they were more brutal, but because they were more decent. The ship docked at Bremerhaven in cold December rain. Klaus disembarked into a Germany he barely recognized. The cities were ruins. People moved through the streets like ghosts, hollow-eyed and desperate. He made his way home slowly. The village where he had grown up was mostly standing, though damaged. He found his mother alive, older than memory, living in 2 rooms of their house. His sisters had survived, married to men who had returned broken from the Eastern Front. They sat together that first evening, his mother crying and clutching his hands. Klaus told them about Texas, about the camp, about working on a farm where the owner treated him with respect. His mother shook her head. God was watching over you, to keep you safe in America, while Germany was dying. Klaus thought about this. Perhaps it was God, or perhaps it was simply the nature of a society that had not forgotten how to see humanity in its enemies. In the years that followed, Klaus worked. He found employment helping reconstruct farms, using skills he had learned in Texas. Eventually, he managed to lease land and began farming for himself. He married a woman from a neighboring village, had children, built a modest life in a new Germany. He never spoke much about the war. When his children asked, he told them simple facts. He did not tell them about the profound transformation that captivity had worked in him, about the daily lessons in trust that had dismantled everything he thought he knew. But he lived those lessons. He treated his workers fairly. He taught his children that strength came from character, not force. He participated in the new democracy, helped rebuild not just buildings, but the social fabric the Reich had torn apart. Sometimes, late at night, he would think about Sam Holloway and wonder if the farmer was still working that land in Texas. Klaus hoped so. He kept a photograph from those years, a group photo taken at the camp, prisoners and guards standing together, squinting in the Texas sun. Looking at that photo, In his later years, Klaus could barely recognize himself. That young man had believed in things that seemed incomprehensible now. The man who returned from America was different, changed by the strange gift of captivity, by the paradox of being imprisoned in freedom and learning what freedom truly meant. The years passed. Klaus grew old, working his land, watching Germany transform itself from ruins into a prosperous democracy. The process was slow and painful, but it moved forward. Klaus never returned to America. He thought about it sometimes, wondered if Camp Concordia still stood, if Holloway's farm was still there. But he did not go. That America lived in his memory now, preserved like a photograph, unchanging. In the spring of 1978, Klaus was working in his garden when he felt a pain in his chest. He sat down, looking out over the land he had tended for 3 decades. He was 79 years old. He thought about that day in Tunisia when he had raised his hands in surrender. He thought about the Liberty ship. He thought about the first morning at Camp Concordia. He thought about Sam Holloway handing him the keys to a truck. May 7th, 1978. I am an old man now. I want to set down this truth. The strongest thing a nation can do is show mercy to its enemies. The Americans did this not because they were naive, but because they were strong enough to see past the uniforms. They defeated Germany with weapons, but they defeated me, what I believed, with simple decency. I was their prisoner, and they set me free. They freed me from lies, from ideology, from the idea that strength meant domination. I learned that trust is courage. The Americans had that courage. Germany did not. We were their enemies, and they treated us like men. That is a victory no army can achieve through force. Klaus died 3 days later, quietly, his family around him. At his funeral, his children spoke of his dedication and to his farm, his commitment to the new Germany, his quiet respect for everyone. They did not know the full depth of the transformation their father had undergone in Texas. But perhaps it was better that way. The lesson Klaus had learned was not one that could be told easily. It had to be lived. It was a lesson about power. Not the power to destroy, which Germany had possessed, but the power to build, to trust, to see humanity in enemies. That power had defeated him more thoroughly than any general on any battlefield. And in that defeat, he had found something, a way to be human again, to shed ideology and stand before the truth that people, regardless of nation or uniform, shared more than separated them. The prison camp in Tunisia was decommissioned after the war. The barracks were dismantled. Nothing remains now but historical markers and photographs, evidence of a strange chapter when hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers lived on American soil, trusted with freedom that seemed to make no sense. But it made perfect sense. The Americans understood something their enemies did not, that the war was about proving which system was worthy of survival. They proved it through the simple act of treating prisoners with decency. In doing so, they won a victory that outlasted the military one. They converted enemies into witnesses, prisoners into believers. They demonstrated that a free society was not weak, but strong, not chaotic, but ordered, wise enough to understand that trust was the foundation of lasting peace. Klaus Hartmann was one of those witnesses. He carried that testimony back to Germany and lived it quietly, teaching by example what he could not explain in words. The farm in Gez still exists, though the Holloway family sold it decades ago. The land produces cotton and cattle, unchanged. Sometimes, when the wind blows across those fields, it might carry echoes, men speaking German as they mended fences, the rattle of a truck driven by prisoners trusted to return. But mostly it is just wind and earth and the work of making things grow, which is what Klaus learned to do. To take hard soil and coax something living from it. To build rather than destroy. To trust rather than fear. That was the strange gift he received as a prisoner of war. That was the lesson that traveled home with him and shaped his life. That was the truth he could not have learned any other way. That real power comes not from forcing others to obey, but from the courage to trust them to choose freely. The Americans had that courage. They extended that trust, and in doing so, they won a victory that had nothing to do with tanks or planes, but everything to do with what kind of nation they were. Klaus understood this finally. The Americans did not let them walk free because they were careless. They did it because they were strong enough to believe in something more powerful than fences, that people, given respect and dignity, would respond with honor. It was a gamble that should not have worked, but it did, because it was not really a gamble at all. It was a statement of faith, faith in humanity, faith that the bonds of trust were stronger than the barriers of enmity. That faith changed Klaus Hartmann's life. It changed thousands of lives, and perhaps it helped change Germany itself, providing living proof that there was another way, another definition of strength, another path forward from the ruins. This is the story rarely told, not of battles, but of the quiet victory, won through mercy, not of conquest, but of conversion, not of enemies destroyed, but of men reclaimed from ideology and returned to their humanity. It happened in a prison camp in Gez, where the fences were low and the trust was high, where enemy soldiers walked free and came back because they had given something more valuable than freedom. They had been given their dignity back. And that was the weapon that won the war. Not in the conventional sense, but in the only sense that ultimately mattered. The Americans had proven what kind of nation they had built. They had shown that democracy was not weak, but strong, not naive, but wise enough to understand that the treatment of enemies reveals the soul of a nation. Klaus learned this lesson well. He never forgot it. And in teaching it to his children, through his sons, he helped ensure that the wisdom of his captivity would outlive him, would ripple forward into a future where former enemies could become partners, where trust could replace fear. The barbed wire has rusted away. The guard towers have crumbled. The barracks have been dismantled. But the lesson remains, preserved in the memories of old men who lived through something extraordinary, that sometimes, in the midst of the world's greatest conflict, mercy triumphs over hate. That trust, extended even to enemies, is the truest form of strength, and that the simple act of treating prisoners like human beings can defeat an ideology more thoroughly than any army ever could. This was the strange truth of the German prisoners of wars in America. This was the victory that history rarely records, but that mattered most. This was what Klaus Hartmann learned, that the Americans had won not because they were more brutal, but because they were more decent. And decency, in the end, is the only victory that lasts.